My name is Morris Williams, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you to another exciting evening at the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm sure you know this book is a wonderful combination of mystery and historical events set in the time of when Senator McCarthy is roaming around Washington, so you get some vignettes with regard to Kefauver and McCarthy and Lyndon Johnson, as well as mystery involving fictional characters that our speaker has created. He is a true Philadelphia person because his three favorite sports teams are the Eagles, the 76ers, and the Phillies. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a raucous Philadelphia welcome to Philadelphia's son, Jake Tapper.
Hi, everyone. Mom, Dad, Shelley, Debbie, Andy, David and Lenore. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. You did leave out a few jobs that I had. I scooped ice cream at Baskin-Robbins Ardmore West. The best flavor is mint chocolate chip. The worst flavor is bubble gum. What is wrong with you people that you would order bubble gum? There are 31 flavors. And I also worked at the Gap in Center City. I don't even know if it's still there. But I worked really hard to get enough money to have a light blue jean jacket, which I wore in the 1980s. And I'm sure my wife has thrown it away. Do I need to lift this up? Okay, is that better? It's great to be home. Thank you so much for coming out. And finally, a room full of people who would like to spend an hour talking about Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. I could have that conversation. I have bored my staff having that conversation. It was very exciting. The Philadelphia Eagles were great. A nice kid from Akiba, Mitch Reutman, I think is his name. No, Ari Reutman. Ari Reutman works for the Eagles, and he saw me tweeting desperately every Sunday for 5 years. And finally, when we made it, because I'm on the team, made it to the NFC Championship, he gave me 2 tickets, and I took my dad. And then the Twin Cities was a bridge too far for my dad, but I did get to go to the Super Bowl, which of course was an amazing game. I wish I could go back and enjoy it knowing the ending, because up until that last play, I was, the whole time. And I got to meet Rob McElhaney from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Does anybody here ever watch that show? He was there and, just desperate for another Philadelphia, and I hugged him after the game, which makes no sense whatsoever. But he grew up, do you know this? He grew up at 2nd and Moy-Mensing, Rob McElhaney. So just right around the corner. Yeah, just incredible. All right, that's enough Philly stuff. So I wrote a novel, and they published it. And we're going to debut at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's crazy, really. Also today, in felling information for the front few rows, it was announced that Millennium Films is going to make a movie based on my last book, The Outpost, An Untold Story of American Valor, about a real nonfiction story about a combat outpost in Afghanistan. And they announced they're making the movie. Scott Eastwood is going to play, I don't know, okay, so Scott Eastwood is going to play Clint Romeshay, and some other actor I've never heard of is going to play Ty Carter, and Orlando Bloom is going to play Ben Keating. So for anybody who read The Outpost, this is just an unbelievable experience. They're filming it in Bulgaria, so I will not be on set, needless to say, but it's really fun. So good stuff going on this week. So let me tell you why I wrote this crazy book. I've wanted to write a novel for a long time. My parents will perhaps remember that I wrote a novel in my 20s that never went anywhere. The idea for this one, for the Hellfire Club, came when I learned about the existence in real life of a real secret society called the Hellfire Club. In 1700s, England, in 18th century England, that was truly debaucherous. This audience looks way too refined for me to go into detail about the satanic orgies that they did, but it was a real thing. Actual books have been written about the Hellfire Club, and it was nobility and royals and captains of industry and politicians all going to this one estate, engaging in horrific behavior, and then forming and forging these alliances that then carried on into their other lives, where they had blackmailable information about each other, and also had these alliances. And when I found out that Benjamin Franklin, and I apologize for telling you this about Benjamin Franklin, but you knew that he was not always the nicest, well-behaved boy in the world. So when Benjamin Franklin was in England, he, on occasion, would go to the Hellfire Club. So it occurred to me, what if Benjamin Franklin saw the utility, as well as the other parts of it that he liked, of the Hellfire Club and brought it back to the United States? And that just had me thinking about Washington, D.C. a lot, where I've spent my life since, not the orgies part of it, but the weird alliances and the strange back rooms going on. And just to cut to the chase, I do not know of any secret societies like the Hellfire Club in real life, but I can't imagine that they don't exist, knowing of what men are like, and wealthy men in particular. And knowing what they think they can get away with, which is often on the front page of the newspaper these days. So that's where the origin came in. When I started writing the book, I set it in Philadelphia in the 1700s, and I'm not gifted enough a writer to pull that off. So that after several years of trying to write that, I stopped. I then tried to set it in the modern age, but I had trouble with the character. The main character's name is Charlie Martyr. Has anybody here read the book? Has anybody? A few people. So thank you. We're selling them after this. The main character's name is Charlie Martyr. He's a World War II veteran and an academic, and he is appointed to a congressional seat. And if there are any sticklers here, I know that one does not get appointed to a House seat, but it's fiction. So he's married to Margaret, who is a zoologist and probably the actual hero of the book. And Charlie and Margaret moved down to Washington in early 1954. She's just found out that she's pregnant, and they're just thrust into this world of 1954. Now, why did I set it in 1954? First of all, the character of Charlie, I just couldn't get him right in the modern age, because I wanted him to be kind of representing America. I wanted him to believe in goodness and to be somewhat naive, and I just couldn't pull off that character in 2018 or 2016 when I was writing it. But 1954 seemed great. First of all, as a tip for any aspiring writers, it is really great to have a plot where you don't have the internet and you don't have cell phones, because every single book written before those two can be ruined with, well, why didn't you just call her on her cell phone? Or why didn't you just Google him? You would see that every city he's been to, there have been a bunch of serial killings. So 1954 was great in that respect. But that wasn't why I picked it. I picked it because 1954, in popular culture, 1954 is portrayed as benign and serene and idyllic. The economic boom is going on. But in truth, it was actually a horrible time right underneath the surface, if you're a woman or minority especially. But then also, just more broadly, there were actual communists infiltrating the government. There were people like Joe McCarthy smearing people as communists who weren't. The Red Scare, the atomic race, all sorts of weird things were going on in early 1954 that I wanted to put in my book. There was Puerto Rican separatists or terrorists burst into the House of Representatives on March 1st, 1954, and shot up the place and shot 5 members of Congress. There were the comic book hearings. I don't know how many of you know about the comic book hearings, but the members of the U.S. Senate were actually blaming comic books for juvenile delinquency. And it was a star of the Democratic Party, Estes Kefauver, who had basically won all the primaries for president in 1952, but that got screwed out of the nomination by party bosses who just decided they liked Adlai Stevenson better. He led the hearings against organized crime in 50 and 51, and he wanted another one, and he decided to go in with this senator from New Jersey, Hendrickson, and do the comic book hearings, which really are just, having now read so much about the comic book hearings and actually read Seduction of the Innocent, the book on which the whole premise of the hearings were based, it is such crap. I pardon my language, but it's just complete nonsense, the shoddiest scholarship you've ever read. Anyway, so there's all these fun things going on. I'm going to read a little part of the book. Before I do, I want to tell you a couple stories about it. First of all, I apologize I'm going to give the characters voices, and I apologize for that ahead of time. I'm not an actor. One of the fun things about writing this book was having Charlie and Margaret and other fictitious characters interacting with real people, interacting with Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn and Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy and Eisenhower and Nixon and all the rest. And that was just, as a history buff, a lot of fun to do. And as somebody who, in my real life, has no control over politicians, was great to have. Complete control of politicians, having them say and do everything I wanted them to do, the moment I wanted them to do it. So that was fun. You're going to hear Robert Kennedy, who at the time is the chief Democratic counsel for the McCarthy Committee. You're going to hear, and the McCarthys and the Kennedys were really, not McCarthys, there was only one and he was unmarried, but Joe McCarthy and the Kennedys were very tight, even though they were different parties. And despite the mythology of who the Kennedys were that we all like to believe in. Robert Kennedy was on the committee. He was the chief Democratic counsel, and he was very close to Joe McCarthy. Now, I had the good fortune last year of being on a panel with Robert Kennedy's oldest daughter, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who you might remember was lieutenant governor of Maryland at one point. And so I'm writing this book, and I got to do some fact-checking with her just backstage before this panel we did on the 100th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's birth. And I said, first of all, I've read in so many places that Joe McCarthy was your godfather. Is that true? And she said, no, it's not true, although that's been misreported all over the place for decades. But we were very close. And I asked her, why would you be close with Joe McCarthy? And first of all, he was a very charismatic guy and could be good company. He had a taste for a drink or two. But then second of all, because she said the Irish in that era were very tribal, because you have to think of how the Irish were treated up until fairly recently in this country, that Irish were, that even though the Kennedys were achieving what they were achieving in Massachusetts in the 50s and 60s, the Brahmins of Boston still didn't accept them and still thought they were Irish trash, et cetera. So that was fascinating. Then I read in a book while doing research for the Hellfire Club, because I really did do a lot of research. I was reading, I think it was Ted Sorensen's book about John F. Kennedy, and he kept on referring to Bobby Kennedy as Bob Kennedy, and I'd never heard that before, and I just assumed that I had found something interesting, and I emailed Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, and I said, did people call your dad, did they call your dad Bob? And she said, yes. And that was a very exciting discovery. I have one of the characters in the book saying, don't call him, nobody calls him Bobby, everybody knows him, calls him Bob. And that's directly from Ted Sorensen and Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. And so I was telling this story at a sales conference for the publisher about, 6 months or a year ago, completely forgetting that a different daughter of Robert Kennedy, because he had 100, was in the audience with her own book, because it's the anniversary of her father's assassination this year. Carrie Kennedy Cuomo. It's not easy to keep all these straight, so I want you to be impressed by that. Carrie Kennedy Cuomo was in the audience, and I told the Bob story, and then she got up and she said, well, it's not necessarily true. Some people called him Bob, some people called him Bobby, some people called him Senator Kennedy. And then I went up to her afterwards and I said, what number sister are you? What number? She was 8 or 9 or something. I said, because I got it from the oldest kid. I'm an oldest kid. I know who I believe in the family. So, anyway, I'm gonna read this little excerpt I do a Robert Kennedy voice, and I apologize for it ahead of time, as I said. So in this scene, Charlie has been invited. He's starting to be invited into Washington society. He's been invited by a ranking member, a chairman of the Appropriations Committee, to this big party that's being thrown at the Mayflower Hotel in the penthouse. It's being thrown by Conrad Hilton, who is really excited that Congress just passed a bill to let cheap Mexican labor across the border so he can pay people pennies in his hotels. The party is fiction, but that bill actually passed that day. So I figured, well, maybe Conrad Hilton would do such a thing. And yes, we're still having the same debates over the same issues that we had 75 years ago. So he is in the Mayflower Hotel, and he's having some snide exchange with Roy Cohn, who is a very fun character to write. And then Robert Kennedy comes over. "Evening, Roy," Bob Kennedy said, approaching them. Recognizing Charlie, he said, "Congressman." "Charlie Martyr," Charlie said. Not sure if Kennedy remembered his name. In Washington, Charlie had noticed, people tended to avoid names in case they got them wrong. They tended to say, "Nice to see you," instead of "Nice to meet you," in case they had met you before. New social rules for an egoistic town where every monument and street was named for their predecessors. "Right, of course," said Kennedy. "We met you and your lovely wife at Martin's Tavern. I just heard you're working with Estes," that's Estes Kefauver, "on the upcoming juvenile delinquency hearings." Cohn choked on his drink. It turned out he was laughing. Can I curse in this audience? There's some curses. Okay. It's Roy Cohn, so don't get mad at me. "You're part of those bullshit comic book hearings?" He guffawed dramatically. Kennedy grinned and looked at Charlie apologetically. Charlie was not particularly amused. He'd had enough of Cohn's abrasive company by now. "You were asking me about the commie simps in this room, Congressman," Cohn said. "Well, they worry me a lot more than Wonder Woman does." He took another swig of his drink and stared out the window. "But none of them concern me as much as the commie simps over there in that big white building," Cohn said, motioning with his chin toward the Eisenhower White House. "What must the world look like from that address? Must look upside down. Goddamn Ike protects the commies and screws with Senator McCarthy." Cohn looked at Kennedy. "He's terrified Joe will run for president, you know. Joe could beat him, too." Charlie was incredulous. Joe McCarthy could beat President Eisenhower? Beat the smartest general we've had since Sherman? "Smart," Cohn said. "MacArthur called Ike the best clerk he ever had." "And Ike," said Charlie, "said he studied drama under General MacArthur for 4 years. Kennedy chuckled. "Now, gentlemen, MacArthur," said Charlie sarcastically, pretending to search the skies for a reminder of the general so ignominiously fired by Truman 3 years earlier. "The name rings a bell." "MacArthur is a great man, a patriot," said Cohn. "I'm sure you have a Medal of Honor under your shirt there." "No," said Charlie, "just some shrapnel." He finished the rest of his drink. "Nothing like your paper cuts from the Battle of Torts 101. An awkward silence hung like a noose. Charlie had surprised even himself with that one. Liquid courage, he supposed. Kennedy tried to break the tension. "Why do you think Joe would be a good president, Roy?" "If Joe were president," Cohn said, "the first thing he would do would be to end the Cold War. He'd pick up the phone and call Joe Stalin and say, 'This is Joe McCarthy. I'm coming over tomorrow to talk about things. Meet me at the Moscow airport at 1 o'clock. When he arrived in Moscow, he would sit down with Stalin in a closed room. First, he'd tell a couple dirty jokes. Then he'd look Stalin right in the eye and say, 'Joe, what do you want?' And Stalin would tell him. They would talk man to man, not like pansy diplomats. They'd find out what each of them wanted and settle their differences. But when Joe left, he'd tell Stalin, 'The first time I catch you breaking this agreement, I'll blow you and your whole goddamn country off the map.'" Charlie turned to Kennedy. "He can't honestly believe this rubbish, can he?" "You little establishment punk," spat Cohn. "You think you know anything about defending this nation?" He looked at Kennedy. "Isn't this the same little shit whose daddy got him his seat, who was trying to screw with the General Kinetics acquisition of Goodstone?" Charlie and Kennedy were both taken aback at Cohn's outburst. It was delivered with the virulence of his Cobra strike, drawing attention from nearby guests. That's not how quite I would put it, Roy," Kennedy said, patting him on the back, trying to calm him. "But yeah, Charlie tried to stop the funding for Goodstone. It had something to do with bad gas masks they made in the war that cost the life of one of your men, right, Charlie?" "That's right," said Charlie. "Company made a cruddy product. Clear case of war profiteering." Cohn waved his arms as if he were washing a car with 2 sponges. Forest, he said. Then he started pointing at imaginary items in the air. Trees, he said. Pretty glib talk about the death of an American soldier, Charlie said. Though, Bob, I guess that kind of sacrifice is not a subject Mr. Cohn here could understand, especially these days when he's busy maligning the Army. Now, what I wanted to tell you about that passage that I like so much is the chapter when Roy Cohn is explaining why he thinks MacArthur would be such a good president, because that paragraph is lifted word for word, with attribution at the back of the book, lifted word for word from a biography I read of Joe McCarthy, written by Jack Anderson in 1952. And I thought it was so brilliant because, first of all, it reminded me exactly of what a Trump supporter would say about President Trump and why he would be a good president. He'll sit down, get in a room, they're men, and they'll do this deal. And I just thought that was fascinating. It was not said by Roy Cohn, though. It was said by Joe McCarthy's former campaign manager, a guy named Urban Van Susteren from Appleton, Wisconsin, who went on to have a little girl named Greta Van Susteren. And when I was doing all this stuff, I emailed Greta, who's a great person, and I said, "Are you related to Urban Van Susteren? Is this?" And she says, "My dad." And then she sent me a photograph of her parents getting married, and Joe McCarthy was the best man. Small world. And she has this special access to the McCarthy papers at the University of Wisconsin, Appleton, I think. Anyway, like I said, very small world. Charlie, in the book, the allusions to the bad gas masks, is somebody who comes to Washington who wants to do good. He's an Eisenhower Republican. He has faith in the American system. He just fought for his country. And he believes in his country. And he comes down, and the very first thing he does is he hears that this company, Goodstone Rubber and Tire, is about to get some money from the federal government, and he knows that company made bad gas masks, and one of his men was killed in France during the war because of the gas mask. And he tries to stop it. And then little by little, this attempt to do good requires him to compromise, one compromise after another, until, it's like easing your way into a swamp, I guess, and then all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you're completely in over your head. And Charlie, in many ways, represents a lot of the people I see come to Washington, D.C. They're good people, they're decent people, Democrats, Republicans, and in order to do what they want to do, in order to do good, they make compromises, whether it's to keep themselves in power, or whether it's to never go against their party, or whether it's to raise money, which they spend about a third to a half of their days doing, raising money so they can keep their jobs. They make compromise after compromise after compromise. And that's one of the things I tried to get at in this book. Obviously, one of the other things that I tried to get at in this book, McCarthy was always going to be a character in the book. You said a book in 1954. Joe McCarthy's going to be in it in Washington, D.C. But, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And when you read about Joe McCarthy today, there's a lot of rhyming. A major political force who sucks out all the oxygen of the room with what he's doing. A propensity to lie and to smear, a group of reporters who don't know how to handle it initially, a political party, two political parties really, who don't know how to deal with it either. One party doesn't want to go too hard against it because they don't want to be painted as communists. The other party, the Republicans, know that what McCarthy's doing is indecent, and yet they don't want to alienate his base. Yeah, so it rang a little true and familiar. There's a chapter in the Jack Anderson biography of McCarthy that was published in 1952, an entire chapter attacking the media for covering Joe McCarthy's smears on his rise as if there didn't exist empirical fact, as if there weren't such a thing as truth, and sliming people. And then they start to criticize Joe McCarthy once he gets to power, and then he turns around and starts calling them all communists. it just reminded me a lot of the same challenges we're facing today. In addition, the swamp that President Trump rails against, and is not wrong to be railing against, is something that I wanted to depict because it was, believe it or not, even swampier in 1954 than it is in 2018, before the post-Watergate reforms, before transparency, before so many media outlets created such a sense of competition that people were more aggressively covering the government now than they were then. So those themes, both about, to a degree, and thematically by President Trump, were ones that I played up a little bit, but to be honest, probably not more than a page and a half more than it would have been, because McCarthy's such a rich character. I'm just going to say a couple more words, and then I'm just going to open the floor to questions. And there'll be microphones coming around, and you can just raise your hand, and I'll point out people, so you don't have to get up. But before I take questions, tell me who you are and where you're from. I am asked two things about the book that I wanted to answer ahead of time, because I get to ask this every time. One is, when did you have time to write a book? So my parents will tell you that I'm a little intense and I'm a little nuts about working and achieving, and that's just part of who I am, and I've made peace with it. So one of the things I would do is, once I decided on this book, which I did work on for like the idea for a decade, and then the last 4 years working on an outline and then doing chapter by chapter, is the lesson for any aspiring journalists or aspiring writers here. The lesson of writing every day is just a really good lesson, even if it's just for 15 minutes. If you can take 15 minutes and write every day. If you write 15 minutes a day, by the end of the week, that's an hour and 45 minutes. That's not nothing for writing a novel. I mean, that might be 10 pages. So it does add up. The other question is, what do I have in common with Charlie? I get asked that a lot. And not a lot, really. Charlie is a war hero. I am not. Charlie is much better looking and younger than I am. I do have two things in common. One, Charlie has a very strong wife, which I have, and she is the hero of the book, I think. And I think it's fair to say that my wife is the hero of our family. And to a larger degree, perhaps, Charlie has a really good sense of smell, which becomes important to the plot in the book. And I have a really good sense of smell. And my brother has a really good sense of smell. And it's awful. Just so you know, it's not a good thing to have. It's not a lot of peppermint out there. Certainly not in Washington. So that's the Hellfire Club. And I've been lucky enough that people have been saying nice things, and we just got a nice review in People magazine, and I saw a sneak preview of a review in Tablet magazine, and we've got nice write-ups in other places, and it's really a kick. So I don't know if I'm going to do another one or not, but that's the Hellfire Club, and I hope you buy it, and I hope you like it.
Have any politicians from that era who are still alive, or any current politicians, have any of them read the book and given you any comments on it?
I heard from an ex-politician who shall remain nameless, who read the book, and he said it depressed him because it reminded him of how backstabbing he found Congress to be. But he liked the book, but it depressed him on a personal level. I have not heard, I don't know that anybody in the book is alive anymore. I'm pretty sure they're all gone. Margaret Chase Smith is gone. She's a hero in the book. Eisenhower, Nixon, McCarthy, the Kennedys. So I don't think anyone is alive about it to comment. That's just how it worked. Current politicians, just that one who said it to me off the record, but I have not heard anything. I mean, the heroes of the book are politicians, and the villains of the book are politicians. So I hope people don't think it's like an anti-politician book. It is very critical of how Washington exists, which is an entire system that seems built to sand down anybody's principles and impulses to do good, which is not to say that people aren't there still trying to do good. They are, absolutely. But whether it's a compromise of I'm going to spend a third instead of a half of my day fundraising, or whether it's a compromise of I'm not going to say anything bad about anybody in my party, even when they behave inexcusably. They make compromises, the kind of compromises that maybe we all make in our lives to a lesser degree. But when it's hard to imagine the current political system as the best one to be designed, although I can't think of a better one, to get the best results for the American people. But as I said, I can't think of a better one.
My name is Cheryl Lockerbie, and I'm from South Jersey, but I've lived all over Philadelphia too. So
It's okay to be from South Jersey.
I feel I have to
We love you.
apologize.
It's
for
okay.
That.
We like your full-service gas.
4 o'clock. 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in my house is known as tapper time.
Oh,
So-
that's great.
So you said you have no control over what politicians say or do, but if you did, what would you like Donald Trump to say or do right now?
Right now,
Yes.
I would like him to focus on his agenda and not lie and not smear people. I mean, it's just very simple. I don't have an issue with his policies. I cover them as I would cover anybody else's policies. I, in fact, think it's a good idea to shake up conventional wisdom in Washington about how we think about trade or how we think about sending our men and women abroad to fight our wars. And the issue I have with any politician is, are you telling the truth and are you behaving in a decent way? And I would like it if he could get that under control, just as a journalist, because I would prefer to be covering North Korea and trade and the economy and whatnot. As a citizen and somebody who has an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, I don't like having to explain why Donald Trump was making fun of somebody with a disability. It's something that I can't explain, and I don't want to have to explain that. So that's what I would do. It's more of a, I think other people have tried this already, by the way. It's not like this idea is original to me. I mean, I think Reince Priebus and, people, John Kelly, I think people are trying to get him to tone it down and to focus on what he wants to achieve for the American people and get results. And, perhaps, I hope to God he gets results in North Korea. I hope that's successful. But that's something that it's not a specific request of him, what I want him to say, but a way I would want him to behave and things I would want him to stop saying. And I think, by the way, he would be a much more successful president if he did that. I don't know anyone who disagrees with that, actually.
And I'd like to ask you if in the course of writing your book, there's some, do you feel that Robert Mueller in some way equates with Joseph N. Welch?
No, I don't. I don't know what Mueller's going to find. And again, it's not like I think Donald Trump is Joe McCarthy. They're very different. But there was rhyming. But I don't know what Mueller's going to find beyond what's been reported, and it might be nothing. And I don't think that he's going to confront President Trump for smearing people, which is ultimately what Joseph Welch did. A really interesting book, if you're interested in the Army McCarthy hearings, and it was kind of one of the sources that I used for this book is a guy named David Nichols wrote a book called Ike and McCarthy, and his basic premise was that Eisenhower, even though he was quiet about McCarthy, was methodically setting a trap for him, and that the Army McCarthy hearings were all part of a strategy, and that's part of the book also. Basically bait McCarthy to take on the Army, which he had no problem doing because he'd already smeared General Marshall. I mean, it wasn't like it was a new thing for him to go after, more heroic people than himself. And bait him into it, and then after it was clear that Roy Cohn's friend, Private David Schein, had been given preferential treatment, and they'd requested it. So he rope-a-doped him. I mean, he kind of set a trap for McCarthy. That's the argument, anyway. But no, I don't see a comparison. I mean, but ask me in 3 years. I'll tell you. I don't know what Mueller has. If he gives a speech and he says, "At long last," then maybe we'll have something.
The question is about Donald Trump and Roy Cohn. Do you find anything what your thoughts are, Roy Cohn and Donald Trump, and their relationship, and
Yeah, I mean, there is this interesting connective tissue that Joe McCarthy's protege was Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn's protege was Donald Trump. That's just a fact. And if you read The Art of the Deal, which I have, there's a section where Donald Trump talks about how he looks down on people with who extol their integrity, because what matters to him is not integrity, is loyalty. And that was actually ultimately the downfall of Joe McCarthy, is that he was loyal to Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn was loyal to David Schein, and they all got trapped in this mess. I don't know if that's, Trump has a Cohen, not a Cohn, Michael Cohen, and I don't know how that loyalty situation is going to play out. Not well for one of them, but I think that some of the techniques are just were handed down. I mean, I think Roy Cohn, by Trump's own admission, and he writes about it, and he's talked about it, learned a lot at the feet of Roy Cohn, who played the media very well, who was big and brash. So there is a connective tissue, but it's not in the book. Trump's name is not in the book. You can't write about Joe McCarthy and not hear some of the same debates that people are having today about how far should somebody go to decry something that they think is morally wrong. One of the things I learned in this book, when researching this book, is about Senator Margaret Chase Smith, who was a Republican from Maine, the first woman elected to both the House and the Senate, and really one of my heroes now. She went to the floor of the Senate in 1950. She was on the Senate subway, and Joe McCarthy saw her and said, why, Margaret, you look very serious. Are you going to go give a speech? And she said, why, yes, and you will not like it. And it was her Declaration of Conscience speech, where she decried McCarthyism. And that was in 1950. Edward R. Murrow is a hero of mine, but he didn't take on McCarthy until 1954. That's a year after Walt Kelly did in Pogo. I mean, journalists were really late to this train. And the Senate, of course, was horrifically late. The beginning of 1954, when this book starts, McCarthy's at the height of his power. He's literally thinking about challenging Dwight Eisenhower, who's in his own party, for the presidency in 2 years. By the end of the year, he's been destroyed. He gets censured by the Senate, and 3 years later, he dies. So how to handle when people are behaving indecently is a theme in the book, and something that I think can be resonant today. And by the way, it's not just Trump. I mean, you see indecent behavior. He might be showing a lot of it, but I mean, it's bipartisan. I remember there was a congressman named Cedric Richmond who made a very obscene joke about Kellyanne Conway. I mean, really just misogynistic and offensive. And Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic House leader, was on my show, and I asked her what she thought, and she said she hadn't heard anything about it. And I said, okay, well, now you have, and what do you think? And she wouldn't decry it. Just something happens when you're in Washington and you pledge allegiance to a team that sometimes you don't see the indecency in front of you, or you're not willing to take a stand on it. And it's very disappointing.
You've been talking now a lot about what was then the press didn't do. Would you talk a little about aspirationally what you would see media leaders doing in challenging what they see and standing up? Because I think there were people doing it.
First of all, let me just say that, it's weird right now when people think I'm biased against Trump, because for 8 years I heard that I was biased against Obama. And President Obama was not a super huge fan of mine. We don't keep in touch. But I felt like it was my job to point out when he was saying things that weren't true, and when he was, and just to provide critical coverage. I like the fact that the media now has an adversarial stance towards the president. I don't have a problem with him not coming to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I don't think any president should feel comfortable in a room full of reporters. And I hope that my brothers and sisters in journalism keep this adversarial stance for the next president. And then one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. Whether it's Oprah, or Chelsea Clinton, or Mike Pence, I don't care. But I can tell you there were times in that press room when I was a White House correspondent during the Obama years when I felt very alone asking a question about something that I thought deserved attention, whether it was, can you really promise that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor? I mean, I didn't see how you could keep that promise. And so I like the fact that the press is adversarial, and more so now, and emboldened, and I want us to stay that way. It bothers me when NBC had a huge mistake today, and I take no delight in that, even though they're a competitor. They reported that, well, I don't even want to repeat the lot, but they reported something wrong, and then they had to retract it. And that really bothers me when we get it wrong, because it reflects on all of us. So we need to rise to the occasion, we need to keep being adversarial, and we need to get our facts right. So that's what I would think, and I think that, you know, maybe some good can come of this crazy era. Maybe we can all like re-find our voice and not have presidents come and have cocktails with us because they shouldn't want to. That's what I think personally.
Why do you think that Fox News is so successful and has such a large audience all the time?
I think that Fox News is so successful because they provide coverage that leans to the right, and generally speaking, everyone else can be seen, at least a little bit, leaning to the left. I don't think I lean to the left, but I see examples of coverage that I think leans to the left in every non-Fox network. Fox is not so successful compared to ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, but, you know, when you compare each individual one, or when you compare CNN and MSNBC to Fox, they're successful. I think that they provide coverage that leans to the right, and some of it I think is just down the middle coverage, and I think there are some excellent reporters there and excellent producers there who I know. I can't really speak to what they do in prime time because I don't understand it, but I don't understand a lot of what I see on TV. Does that answer your question at all? No? I mean, put it this way. If you're conservative and you think that the media leans left, and you turn on the television and you see stories about, say, abortion, cast in a way in which there's portrayed only one acceptable point of view, and that's and you disagree with it, and then finally a channel comes along that maybe you feel is more fair to your point of view, and if you look at the polls, this is a very divided country, why wouldn't you go to the channel? And I'm not talking about the primetime stuff like whatever Hannity does, but just Brett Baer or people like, or Shepard Smith, or, I mean, why wouldn't you watch that if you want to have your point of view reaffirmed? I think a lot of people want to have their points of view reaffirmed. I think that's a trouble with media being ideological or partisan these days, is too much people hearing, people going into a bubble. You know, sometimes I feel like there's one channel that's portraying, you know, that says like the whole Russia investigation is a hoax, and there's another channel in which it seems like President Trump's about to be arrested any second. And then obviously I'm biased, but then there's another channel where we're trying to make sense of it all. So I don't understand anybody who just wants to have their point of view reaffirmed and not challenged. But so if you're watching television news, wouldn't it be great to just have the facts and not have all this agenda? That's right, 100%. That's why I have panels of a Democrat, a Republican, and a reporter. That's why I make an effort to have people from the administration and people critical of the administration. I agree. But that's not what a lot of people want right now. I feel like in prime time especially, people want to put on their team jerseys. And, you know, the way I watch the Eagles, the way everybody here watches the Eagles. And That's not what I like at night. I don't want to, but I agree with you. But it's not just Fox. I can't defend Fox. I'm not here to defend Fox. But I also see things on MSNBC that I can't understand.
Philly. I have two questions. One question is, what did you think of Jason Kelly's speech after the Super Bowl? As well as, what do you think of the sort of underdog spirit that we had as a city, and do you think that plays any success in the national social justice movements, whether it's the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement?
Oh wow, that's like a thesis question. That's an essay question for a college student or a PhD. I loved his speech. I think that we have a chip on our shoulder, and it just comes with being from Philadelphia. I can't explain it. Maybe just because New York's right there, but I also feel a chip on my shoulder about Boston, and they're like half the size of this city, so I can't really explain it. But I think it's good. I think it makes us fighters. I think it makes us gritty. Sometimes it makes us throw snowballs at Santa Claus or batteries. But it's one of the things I love about being a Philadelphian. I don't know how it would play into the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter movement, but I'll tell you, it's great to see people standing up for themselves. And while maybe not every step I agree with or every step is appropriate, it's good to see people peacefully protesting. It's good to see people stopping what men have been doing to women behind closed doors for decades, and making this a better world for my daughter and for my son. I find it reprehensible. I read these stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times about moguls and TV anchors, and and the thing that breaks my heart the most about it is the women who left journalism or who left film because of Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer or whatever. It just breaks my heart. So I'm glad that people are taking a stand. I know it's tough to be the first woman. I know it's tough to be the 10th woman. I don't think it has anything to do with Philadelphia per se, but I'm glad that women are standing up for themselves.
Thank you. My name is Rob, and I live in the Fairmont neighborhood.
Okay.
A quick comment. I've always liked the word obsequious, and I thought that your use of it was very poignant. So thank you for that when you interviewed Steve.
I hope that my English teachers at Akiba Hebrew Academy were proud when I used not only obsequious but factotum to describe Stephen Miller. Words that I clearly learned because I was preparing for my SATs, and I don't think I've ever said the word factotum. So however it burst into my head from studying at the Ballackinwood Library, or this one, for my SATs. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so my question is, are there interviews that become so heated, so emotional, that you have trouble subsuming your own emotions, perhaps even anger? I know I do, just watching the interviews.
Stephen Miller was a special case because he was so off. In my view, he was, and not obviously the president disagrees because he tweeted an attack on me afterwards. But because he was so personally nasty. He came there to attack me and to attack CNN, and he wouldn't answer my questions, which were, if you go back and look at the questions or look at the interview, I think the question when he started getting his Irish up, as it were, although he's not Irish, so no offense, was when President Trump, this was when that stupid book, Fire and Fury, had come out, and with one great achievement, getting Steve Bannon to say a whole bunch of nonsense, or not nonsense, I had to say a whole bunch of really out there stuff on the record. That was a great achievement by Michael Wolff, and wow, that was just, that changed the news cycle and everything. But there's a lot of other really shoddy journalism in the book, so I took issue with it. But it was right around the time that Michael Wolff was out there suggesting that something was mentally wrong with President Trump, and President Trump had taken to Twitter, I think that morning or the day before, and talked about how he was a very stable genius. So I asked Stephen Miller if that tweet helped the president make his case, Or perhaps, did it undermine it? And that's when he started just personally attacking me and this and that. That was the only time. I actually, watching it, Terry Gross played it for me last week when I did Fresh Air. So not watching it, listening to it, I'm amazed that I didn't cut it off sooner, and I'm amazed that I didn't sound angrier. I'm okay at keeping my cool in these interviews, but generally speaking, they can get heated, but they're about issues. They can get, I mean, we have people with whom we disagree. Hogan Gidley from the White House was on the show the day before, and we were talking about the Iran, or yesterday, I think, or the day before, and we were talking about the Iran deal. 2 days ago, we were talking about the Iran deal, and it got, I wouldn't say heated, it got feisty, but at the end of the day, he was making his point, I was arguing, a counterpoint, and it was all friendly, and that's all I want. Stephen Miller was a special case. I would note you haven't really seen him on TV much since that interview. However, impressively, President Trump claimed he thought Stephen Miller did. Somehow they are refraining from bestowing that upon the American people much anymore, even though clearly he won that debate.
My question is about back to biased media. As far as Sinclair Broadcasting goes, they're buying up a bunch of local stations. Does it make you worry that there will soon never be anything but biased media, and there's just only going to be bubbles on both sides, and they're having people, I don't know if you saw the scary montage that John Oliver made of everyone saying the same thing.
I saw it, yeah.
I mean, and if it's your local news station and you're just watching it to, watch the weather in the morning, how going forward do we know that there's ever going to be just a non-biased channel to get facts?
Yeah, it bothers me a lot because what bothered me about it was that it was an opinion presented as news, and the opinion was the media is fake except for us, which is the message that Fox News makes, and it's the message that the president gives, which is you can't trust reporters. And that's a really upsetting message. There was a poll out a couple weeks ago that showed 51% of Republican voters think that the media is the enemy of the American people. 51% of Republicans. I mean, I'm not saying the media is perfect, and I'm not saying the media doesn't make mistakes, but the enemy of the American people? I mean, there's a reason that is happening, and that's because of President Trump. Presidents are spiritual leaders. Van Jones talks about this sometimes. John F. Kennedy inspired people to join the Peace Corps, and Ronald Reagan inspired people to go to Wall Street or to maybe to join the military. What kind of spiritual leader is Donald Trump being right now? Where is he leading the country? You could argue that he's having people challenge the conventional wisdom, and again, I don't have an issue with that. But calling reporters the enemy of the American people is very distressing, and people believing it is very distressing. So that message is what Sinclair was doing. They were saying there was a lot of fake news out there, and they weren't saying, be careful of what you read on Facebook because there are a lot of fake websites out there. I think we all know what they were saying. They were saying, don't trust anyone except for us. And that's upsetting, and I feel bad. And look, I feel bad for people who, that's their livelihood is, they went into television journalism to be a local reporter, to tell important stories about City Hall and City Council and the local school board, or, what the police are going through or whatever. And I grew up watching, Jim Gardner and Mark Howard and, the late Jim O'Brien and whatever. I could name every person at Channel 6 off the top of my head. Those are, these are honorable people going into an important profession. Local news is very important, and to have that sullied by Sinclair. I know one of the guys who helps run Sinclair now, Boris Epstein, who used to work at the White House and was responsible for not mentioning Jews in Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2017, which was an interesting decision. I wouldn't have gone that direction. But it's very upsetting. Is there a Sinclair channel in Philly? They're trying to buy Channel 17? Okay, well, God bless. I don't fault them. The people who work there, but that's distressing because that's Big Brother stuff. Repeat it. Can I compare the performance of the press?
At the time of Joe McCarthy with the current performance.
The performance of the press at the time of Jim McCarthy compared to today's performance. I mean, there were amazing journalists back then, but the media was much cozier with people in power back then. They covered things up for presidents. I don't think I need to go down the list of presidents that they covered things up for. John F. Kennedy's in the book, you know, you read. They hid things from people. There's a very brief mention in the book about the columnist Joe Alsop, who was an award-winning and famous columnist, and how he did work for the CIA secretly, which is true. It's in the. I have a whole 15 pages of endnotes at the end of the book because I'm a geek, and but it's true. So I think the media is much better today, believe it or not. And there's also more media criticism today than there was back then. That probably is one of the reasons why there's more criticism of the media and people have more critical views of the media, is because it's a bigger business and more people whose job it is to find fault in what we do, not like it's tough finding fault. But I mean, you know, you look at the war coverage that's being done by CNN correspondents in Syria, or you look at the New York Times and Washington Post coverage day after day, the Wall Street Journal, Philadelphia Inquirer. I mean, I think I think journalism has probably never been stronger. And for all its messiness and occasional mistakes, I mean, they made mistakes back then too. There just, you know, weren't cable channels pointing it out that people made mistakes. So I think it's better. I really do. That doesn't mean that we haven't learned that doesn't mean we've learned all the lessons that we should have from the 50s or from other eras. But I feel good about the state of journalism in America. For the first time ever, I meet young people who want to go into journalism. I walk down the street and people thank me for what I'm doing. They didn't do that during the Obama years, I might point out, but and I wish they had. But I think it's pretty good. I do think it's pretty good. So thank you so much.